Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's Blandin Leadership Roundtable on 5G. My name is Mary Magnuson, and I'm the Blandin Community Broadband Program Administrator. And again, I welcome you to this call. Bill, do you want to introduce our speaker today?
Yeah, great. This is fun. We're getting back to a more technology-oriented topic today after a couple weeks on more community topics. So happy to have everyone on the call today. And we have lucky enough to have Brian Pickering on the call with us today. And he's head of 5G marketing for Nokia, and certainly knows the product. And you know, we've got audience from part of the metro area. We've got a lot of rural participants. And so we always hear about 5G. Certainly there's been a ton of ads over the last 2 years about 5G and what is it and what can it do and how we're going to use this in our communities, all part of the big question. Some in the rural area are pretty skeptical about the reach into rural area. And so I think this will be a great session today to help us understand what 5G is and what it isn't, and how it will impact us no matter where we live. So Brian, welcome, and thanks for joining us today.
Excellent. Thank you, Bill. I appreciate you inviting me here, and I'm going to walk through and give you guys an update on 5G itself. So if I can share the screen and my slides, and we can go from there. Let me know, Bill, if you can see those.
Yes, we do.
Okay. All right. So I've got just a few slides to share with everybody today, and then we can open up for Q&A at the end if you'd like. So first just from a past perspective, right? So just give you kind of where we started and where we're at today, right? So, you know, we looked back in the mid 1800s, we started with the telegraph, right? And so if you look at back then and what we started with and where we've come today, you know, all the way from the rotary phone, which some of you may remember back in the day, all the way to the cell phone today. And at that point, the cell phone, when it came out, it was just voice only. And now we have this, you know, smartphones in our pockets that, you know, it's like carrying around a small computer at this point in time. So we've come a long way from the device side of it at this time. Now, from a network side of it, when networks developed, you know, networks were, you know, you called someone up, they connected you to somebody else. So it was all manually done at that point in time. But then again, like technology, we've evolved into where they had these large computer systems that did it itself. We went into wireless. And now if you look in the bottom right-hand side, we're in these huge server farms is what we have now. And that does all our connectivity, both from a wireless and wireline side of it too, going forward. So that's all really combined here from a network side of it. So we've come a long ways in 150 plus years, but really the technology has really accelerated in the last 50 from what we've seen so far today. Now that's kind of give you a little bit of history lesson. Now we look for the future and okay, where is this thing headed from a consumer perspective, right? And so on the chart here on the left-hand side, I kind of give you a graph here. First is, you know, at the bottom, it shows you, hey, the households in 2011 had roughly about 3 media devices connected per household. And if you look all the way to 2025, they're expecting to be up to 9, right? So that's significant. For my household, that would almost be 2 per person is what that would be plus. But what this really showing you is that, you know, pay TV for the most part is actually declining over time. So a family getting around the TV and watching it as a family, right or wrong, you could argue this, is declining over time. And what is happening is everyone's having their own device, and so they want to be able to watch their own media when they want to watch their own media, right? And this is not just family, but this is just everybody in general. And as you can see is that green bar, which is the professional stream content, which is like your Netflix and Hulu and things along those lines, is actually growing considerably. And along with the user-generated content, which is like your Instagrams, your Snapchat, YouTube videos, things along those lines. So that continues to grow over time. And what we're seeing really is you're going from a broadcast to a unicast type of approach. And so therefore, as this continues to grow, we're going to have networks that are able to handle this type of workload here going forward. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get into the 5G side of it. But I just want to set up the scenario from a consumer perspective of what the demand is going to look like here in the future. Okay, from a Wi-Fi perspective, when we talk about broadband wireless, Wi-Fi is a great solution, right? For indoors, wherever you go, you got it in your house, you have it in your Starbucks that you go to, you have it in your hotels, and it's great from that perspective where you can't get very good in-building penetration, right? And also, it's help offloading the network when you get inside the building too. But over time, as you can see, Wi-Fi has evolved just like we have with our cellular systems that we have today and what we'll show you in 5G. And as you can see, over time, it's been developed to handle capacity about as far as the number of users go. Also be able to handle the types of use cases. So, early on it was simple email. And as it's evolved, I've added video, you've added internet searching, and where we're at today, you can do just about anything, as far as video calls like we're doing as of right now, right? So it has evolved over time, and it's really been evolving to compete against the cellular technologies, right? So the Wi-Fi people want to make sure they have their share of the business too, as of right now. So again, it continues to grow. So now we start to look at from a 4G as we move into 5G perspective, right? So 4G came available roughly about 10 years ago or so. And when it rolled out, you're looking at about 150 megabits per second download speed. And back then, that was great. We're coming from 3G into 4G. Now that's when the smartphones came around. You're starting to have these applications. You can start to surf the internet, right? So at that point, it was awesome, right? So now we start to have these devices in our pockets that we can actually do all this, and we don't have to be in front of our computer. And that was really focused in on what I call one of the three pillars, which is mobile broadband at that point in time. And that's just basically giving your opportunity to search and do data and then download data and things along those lines. But over time, over these last 10 years, 4G or LTE has evolved. And, we had 4.5G at one point in time, and now 4.9 is what they call it. And as you can see, the download speeds are 1.5 gigabits per second. So almost a 10x improvement. And that's just based on the ability that the technology developed. We're able to do carrier aggregation. We get these wider bandwidths, and having a wider bandwidth, you can push more data through it. Now, also with LTE, as it's developed over time, it's also brought in what I call the other two pillars of the triangle here, which is brought in your IoT sensors, which is your LTM and narrowband IoT. And we're allowed to have these types of sensors out there to send information in and to collect information of what's going on. Likewise, we had machine communications where we're starting to bring in some lower latency applications. And as you can see, where we're at there as far as latency is about 10 milliseconds in best case. Typically, what you'll find is around 50 milliseconds is what your LTE network will support, roughly, depending on from where you're at from the network side and how it's set up. But then again, now this has evolved now into 5G. And we'll talk about 5G here in the next several slides. But as you can see on the 5G side, it takes this and makes this much faster, much more reliable. And then we'll also have many, many more sensors that we can actually handle from a capacity perspective. And so really 5G brings much, much more capacity going forward. Okay, so from a 5G side of it, as I mentioned, the three pillars, and I kind of go around this spectrum here, first starting at the top of extreme mobile broadband. Extreme mobile broadband, I showed you mobile broadband from an LTE perspective. They put the extreme part of it into it, so you get this huge, huge capacity that you can handle, right? So you're looking at greater than 10 gigabits per second peak data rates. And so this is where you have this millimeter wave spectrum that you can use, which has huge, huge bandwidths, and that's just where you can push a ton of data through it at any point in time. And this is where you're starting to see the fixed wireless access applications that'll come forward. And this is where you deliver it to the fixed wireless to the home or to the business or whatever that may be at that point in time. As we move down to the right-hand side, then we get in this critical machine communications where you get into these low latency, high reliability type of applications. And we're talking low latency, you're eventually getting down to lower than 1 millisecond radio latency is what you are. And then you get these high reliability, zero mobility interruptions. And the whole intent behind this one is you get into these use cases, what we call ultra reliability, low latency, where you're connecting machines, you're connecting robots, for example, where they have to talk to each other in real time. And therefore, if you think about it from a manufacturing standpoint, you can have these robots all talking to each other wirelessly, and you don't have to have wires running through your manufacturing facility. And therefore, if you have to retool your manufacturing, you can do it very quickly because you can move these machines around. You don't have to do all this wiring and rewiring and things along those lines. And then likewise, the third pillar is this massive machine communications. Again, we had this on the LTE side of it, but this brings in so much more capacity when it comes to connectivity, right? So you're talking over 1 million devices per kilometer, per square kilometer. And then you're also, by using this data and sending this data in, you're just sending in little snippets of information. And by doing this, you can actually sustain battery life for up to 10 years. And so this gives us the opportunity to bring in information, do some type of analytics on it, AI on it, and then tell the robots, the computers, or a person to go do something, right? So we all bring this all together into an analytics type of analysis, and that'll help drive further use cases down the road at this point. Okay, question? Okay, I'll keep going. Okay, so from a spectrum side of it, so there's always this spectrum that you got to have available for 5G, and really what 5G brings is new spectrum that can be used by all operators or countries around the world. And so what I've got listed here is just a set of countries down the left-hand side, spectrum, and I made this very simple. It's much more complicated now. There's much more spectrum available in all these different countries around the world, but I boiled this down into 2 areas, and I wanted to kind of highlight those 2 areas here at this point on the slide is, and now first I'll talk about millimeter wave, right? So millimeter wave is 24 to 28 gigahertz, which is probably the most common worldwide. There's 39 gigahertz in the US that's being used today by AT&T as their primary millimeter wave band. But you can see here at the 24 to 28, most common across the world. Europe, you'll see at 26 gigahertz. So it's good from that perspective on high bandwidth, as I mentioned, but you can think about it from a coverage perspective, it's relatively small. It's probably the best way of looking at it, right? Where then if you look in the left-hand side where I have 3.5, everywhere else in the world, they're launching with 3.5 gigahertz initially with 5G. And that's been their base one to deploy with. Here in the US, we haven't deployed 3.5, and so we're somewhat at a disadvantage as of right now compared to everybody else. And if you look at if you think about 3.5 gigahertz as an example, it has, in my mind, has the best from a capacity perspective and coverage perspective. It balances the both of those the best. Where millimeter wave, high bandwidth, small area. You can think of it as up to maybe 500 meters it can cover. That's 1,500 yards. Where if you get 3.5, now you're talking in kilometers, several kilometers, and you can get 100 megahertz of bandwidth. You get really good speeds on it. So it really handles it from both sides of it. And so from a US side, as I mentioned, we're at a disadvantage. We don't have that available as of today. Now, it is coming up here. We have auctions coming up here shortly with the PAL licenses for CBRS. And then the C-band, which is coming available here later this year for auction, will be here in the December timeframe. That auction will happen in December, but then they need another year to clear the spectrum, and then whoever purchases that spectrum can start and deploy in December of 2021. So for us, 3.5 is still, for the most part, if you look at it, a year away as of right now. So that's how the spectrum lines up, and really it can be a disadvantage from us from a roaming perspective when it comes to 3.5. So it's very important spectrum for everybody to have, specifically here in the US. Okay, I threw this one here to give you a perspective on South Korea and how 5G has taken off in South Korea and what's really driving it. And really, South Korea was one of the first ones to launch with 5G in the world. Now, you could argue, that was Verizon first or was South Korea first, and I think there was hours difference between the two. But for the most part, Korea launched back in April of 2019. And in the left-hand graph, you can see the rate of growth that they've had across all three operators there, and it's quite fairly significant. And in fact, it's much, much more aggressive than what LTE was when they first launched it in Korea at that point in time. So, and they have approximately about 10% of their mobile bases converted to 5G already. And if you can see in the middle graph, you can see the blue part is LTE capacity or consumption. The orange one is 5G. And as you can see, the growth is taken off on the 5G side of it. But on the next chart to the right of it, where you have the bars, you can see the amount of usage on 5G. It's almost triple of what they used to do on LTE. So the point is, you've given the consumer more bandwidth, more speed, and they're taking advantage of it. Now, granted, South Korea is much different than the US. I mean, Korea is a very high technology. They're very high technology country. They really push that. They're really into that. So the consumer really takes advantage of it and is really buying into it. And as you can see, they're buying on the mobile growth side and their consumption side of it. Now, what's driving that, or how they've been able to push that in South Korea, is they've done number of things. It's online gaming they've done AR, VR type of applications. They offer it as part of the service for 5G. So if you want 5G and you want AR, you can get it, and they're also offering that as you get a free set of AR goggles or something like that. Or they may give an initial subscription of 5G online gaming for free, but then eventually you have to pay for it, right? And they've also been able to drive the average revenue per unit growth also in South Korea. So if you want 5G, you have to ante up and you have to pay extra per month in order to get it. So they've been able to do that in South Korea, and that's also been helping them from a growth perspective on that side too. So the whole point behind it is, when it comes to 5G, if you build it, they will use it, is really what it boils down to. And South Korea is a great example of that. Okay, so coming to the US here, right? So when we come to the US, there's the big three, is what I call it today. And so first of all, you got Verizon, which has been focused on millimeter wave. And they've launched in 34 cities around the US. And it's all within the dense urban area. And I put a graph up here of my hometown here, Chicago, where I live. And you can see in the dark, I guess the dark red, versus the light pink, is that's where they have 5G today. And if you're familiar with Chicago, you can see down by the lakefront Grant Park area, great coverage down there and covered down through the streets, right? So again, millimeter wave, it's got a short range, like I mentioned, about 500 meters at best case. It's good for outdoor coverage. It does not do well on penetrating in building and things like that. So you can see a lot of the street coverage outdoor part is covered. AT&T on the bottom left-hand side, they rolled out millimeter wave 39 gigahertz back a little over a year ago. It was focused on the business side of it, going after the business opportunities. Then in December of last year, they launched 850 megahertz, and they've rolled that out across the US here, covering 170 million pops so far, 344 cities. Again, I put a map of Chicago in there. I pulled this about a month or so ago, so it probably has been updated since then. But for the most part, you can see the coverage that AT&T has within the Chicagoland area. They've pretty much covered the full Chicago area, all the suburbs. And so what's great about it is you get the 5G on your phone, you get that experience is what you have. T-Mobile, which is in the middle here, they launched 600 megahertz back last year also. They've got 220 million pops covered nationwide at this point in time. They have launched millimeter wave back in June of last year on a few markets, but now they're going through and relaunching 2.5 gigahertz. And 2.5 was part of Sprint's network, or was Sprint's network. And so when the mergers came through, it's actually given T-Mobile that mid-band coverage. As you recall, I was talking about 3.5 having that great capacity versus coverage. Well, 2.5 has the same positives behind that, actually. And so T-Mobile right now has all three spectrums available for them. They're using their low band at 600 megahertz. They've got Sprint's 2.5 that they're relaunching now, and they got millimeter wave available. And so you'll see their advertisement. They call it the 3-layer cake, and they're launching that. They did that in New York here a couple months ago, and they'll continue to roll that out going forward. But I also want to use this picture at the bottom here from T-Mobile as an example to show you how coverage compares, right? So as you can see towards the bottom, you'll see like a small where millimeter wave at. So it's a big bar in the middle, but it's fairly small. 2.5, the coverage gets a little bit bigger, but it's not quite as tall, which shows you the capacity that it has. Versus like 600 megahertz, or in AT&T's case, 850 megahertz, huge coverage, bandwidth is a little bit smaller at this point in time. So in the US, what we find is when it comes to speed versus coverage, there's always this debate is which is the best? Is it better for speed or is it better for coverage? And I'm not going to get into the debate of which one it is. I think I'll leave it up to you to decide how you think is the best way of looking at it. But either way, they all have their advantages at the end of the day of which type of use case you want to go after and what you're trying to tackle from a situation perspective, right? So, okay. All right. Use case wise, from a use cases, I put this up here just to give you some general idea of what we look at from use case perspective, what's coming from a timing side of it. Down the left-hand side, I just
Brian,
put in
excuse me.
Yes.
This is Bill. Could you explain a little bit about the difference? I think that graph maybe was too small to see. So the bandwidth, the speeds that are available at those different frequencies.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Bill. Sorry. So, so from a millimeter wave perspective, you're looking at anywhere from 200 to 800 megahertz of bandwidth, right? Which is huge. And now you're looking at speeds up to 2 to 4 gigabits per second as of right now is what you can see when you're looking at that millimeter wave, right? So then when you get in this mid band, this 2.5 or 3.5, usually bandwidths run between 60 megahertz to 100 megahertz, maybe a little bit more than 100 megahertz, maybe 120, 150 is what you're looking at. Now you're looking at speeds somewhere right around 1 gigabits per second is what you're looking for, depending on how much that bandwidth is. And then that low band, as I mentioned, 600 megahertz to 850 megahertz, bandwidth is anywhere from 10 to 20 megahertz channels on average, let's say, but your speeds are in the 40 to 50 megabits, maybe 60 megabits per second is what you're looking at. So those examples, I'll just try to give you a comparison. So if you look at millimeter wave, great for capacity. If you need capacity, downtown urban areas, great for that type of application. It's also great for indoors, using in convention halls, stadiums, things like that. Your low band on the other side, great for coverage, great to have to show the icon on the phone and get you that initial 5G experience with some faster speeds. And if you can see in the chart on the right, you can see the various types of networks. And I pulled this from OpenSignal is what I did. And they did a testing of the networks based off of bandwidth. And you can see the Verizon side, it's huge. But if you go out to the right-hand side, you get down to T-Mobile with their 600 megahertz is fairly small as far as what the bandwidth goes. Better than LTE, but not significantly better. So Bill, I hope that answers your question or your comment.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Okay. Use case wise. Again, I just put down here on the left-hand side just some industries just to show you there's many more out there and just to give you a flavor of where we're at today, right? So the light gray is what you can do with LTE today. And don't get me wrong, you can do a lot of stuff with LTE today that you can do with 5G today also. Specifically, people always ask me, Brian, hey, I've all these IoT sensors. I can do that with LTE today. Why do I need 5G? Well, my answer is that's right. But eventually down the road, there's going to be a huge amount of capacity required because the number of sensors are going to be so much more out there, and you need the capacity in order to do that, right? That's an example. But as we move from left to right, you're starting to see 5G come available. And really, when you look at 2020 timeframe, we're in the light blue area, right? And light blue is this mobile broadband. If you recall, I showed you in that one at the top of the 3 pillars. And so this is really about AR, VR, online gaming. Is really what this is centered around here in the 2020 timeframe and the 2021. But when we get into 2021, now we start to see some of these other use cases starting to come available, right? Some of these low latency applications, some of these sensor type of applications come available. And the reason they're coming a little bit later is for really kind of 2 reasons. One is standards have to be set, and they're being set as of today. There'll be in the next round of standards for low latency will be finished up here this summer. The next set around comes here in about a year away from now. And so anytime the standards are set, you can assume 6 to 9 months later is when the software and the functionality rolls out, ecosystems being developed. And so this is why you're seeing these low latency applications coming in 2021, 2022, and then in 2023, you're starting to see some of this autonomous type of vehicles and things along those lines is what you're going to look at. So again, the whole point behind it, it's going to take time to evolve. It will evolve over time, just like LTE did. And so we just have to be patient. But the other intent behind this is use cases are going more towards the enterprise side or the business side. And that's where we see the big gain for these use cases going forward, specifically in low latency, as I mentioned, with manufacturing, logistics, things along those lines is what I would got. Oh, the other thing would be smart cities, stuff like that.
Hey, Brian.
Yes.
So some of these things, like what's an immersive experience event or a volumetric video communications? What are those things?
Yeah. So yeah, good question. So volumetric video communications would be, you can think of it this way: is it, you have AR, VR, where it's kind of 1 or 2, maybe 3-dimensional. When you get volumetric, now you get into kind of 4-dimensional, right? So you can have people with AR, VR goggles on, like in a learning experience, and you'll have a vision in front of you or something in front of you where you'll be able to see that object, and you'll be able to take that object, and you can think about it. You can take it, and you can move it around to see all 360 of it. You can see inside of it. Things along those lines is what you see from a volumetric video communication. So it's the prime example of that is learning or education, and working together. Is that really what that use case is centered around at that point? So, and immersive is just, again, building off of that, is where you get into multiple dimensions, and you can actually take the experience and you can manipulate it real time there and see it, and that's those types of use cases what you're looking at. So that would be an example of that.
Thanks a lot. That's interesting. It's they're words, and you think, how does this really apply? And you can see it in science and teaching and
right.
Tourism, I suppose, as well, right?
Yes, you can see it in tourism. And in fact, in Greece, one of our operators in Greece, obviously in Athens, huge from a museum perspective. But what they did is they used 5G and AR, VR as people came in to see a particular type of part of the museum or display. They could put on the AR, VR goggles, and would actually bring them to kind of like living with the dinosaurs, so to speak, or living back in the Roman days and things like that. So you can get that real feel experience of being right there like it was back in the Roman Empire and things like that, or even in the Greek mythology, things along those lines is what they've done. So those are prime examples of it. Also, we worked with an operator that was using AR, VR for education in colleges in Italy, and they were bringing that in. And so you could have the students in the classroom with the AR, VR goggles on, working and communicating together, but also they were looking at as, how can I do this for remote learning too? And that was another advantage of that from a remote learning that they were testing with too. And it just gives you the ability to be interacting with your classmates real time. I mean, you may be in a remote setting and things like that. So those are some examples of what they've done here with AR, VR testing today. Another one, we connected vehicles would be another one they've done. I know what I have it on here with in-vehicle mobile broadband basic information. So you can do some of this with LTE today. If you're sitting in your bus and you're riding a public bus transportation, you can download videos and things like that within the bus. But using 5G, you can download it much, much faster. You can get your entertainment right there, would be an example. Also, if you're in your car, you can do it that way. There'd be another example of that too. So those are other examples that they've tested in Italy. Also, was connected ambulance was another one that they've tested that use case. And I'll just explain that a little bit further. And I thought that was really unique on how they did that. Is what they did is on the connected ambulance, which is out here in the 21 timeframe, but the trial they did was they had the Google goggles for the first responders, and as they went out to see the patient, and they're working on the patient there at the scene, information is being streamed back to the hospital. The doctors are watching it. They're actually interacting with the first responders, giving them instructions of what they could do. They move the patient into the ambulance. As the ambulance is taking off towards the hospital, they continue to work with the patient, share vitals, share information. And so when the patient arrives at the hospital, the doctor already knows what's going on. And so they can able to work on the patient immediately, and they don't have this exchange of information between the first responders and the doctor of what actually has transpired so far. And it gives them a leg up is what it does. And it also gives them the ability to look up the patient's history and have that ready to go when they arrive at the hospital too. So
Good.
just a couple use cases that has been tested already over in Europe to give you an example of what could be the possibility coming up here in the future. So
Good. A couple more questions came in. What is FWA?
Yes, fixed wireless access is what FWA is. And fixed wireless access, you can think about it as video to your home or internet to your home, right? So instead of it coming in through the cable or through fiber, it's all done over the air, right? So fixed wireless access that's what that is defined as. And
Yeah, we got a lot of that.
okay.
And then what's the difference between 5G and 5G advanced?
5G and 5G advanced. So 5G is, you can think of it as of right now, is more of what we have today is your mobile broadband is what we have today. So it's your basic non-standalone type of approach. And when I say not non-standalone, that's when you have your 4G core, you have a 5G radio at the cell site. You can think of it that way. When you get to 5G advanced, now you think of it as you have a 5G core system and you have a 5G radio. So the whole network is 5G, and by having it fully a 5G system, both radio and core and transportation layer capabilities, now you bring in these low latency applications and you bring in these massive machine type communications and things like that. So that's what we think of 5G advanced, is when you complete the whole pillar of or the whole triangle of the 5G network. So that's how we look at it as.
Good, thank you.
Okay. Any other questions, Bill?
That's it right now.
Okay, excellent. All right. I think I just have one other slide left here. And so I threw this one in from a rural perspective, right? So rural doesn't get talked much about when we come to 5G, right? It's all about manufacturing. It's about smart cities, it's about healthcare and things like that. And so I threw this one in here. We did this trial out in Iowa back in 2018, is fall of 2018. And the whole intent behind this was to use a smart farm concept. And it was to give the ability for the farmer to access the network every morning to see where the issues were at and to go and to fix those issues. So if you think about it, if you think looking at a grain and hog farm is what this was, instead of going to every building and checking all the hogs in every building that was spanned over several miles, or checking all the grain bins every day, you can actually look on your iPad and say, okay, what's the temperature in the grain bin? What's my moisture? I can look at videos of the hog barns. Is all the hogs, active and acting normally? Is there any issues and any alarms going off and stuff like that? So that was the intent behind this. We did this with 5G. We did a lot of IoT sensors using low band, but the 5G part of it we brought in was for the backhaul of it. and we did some, some videos and things like that is what we did, video surveillance and stuff like that is what we used the 5G side for. And then I put down here at the bottom a YouTube video. Once we share the slides, you can go click on that. It's about a 2-minute video, give you more of the background of what we did there with Charter Communications. So really a great one from a rural perspective if you're interested in that. So, okay, and that's what I had, Bill. So if there's any questions, glad to take them at this point.
Yeah, so 5G, let's stay in rural for a little bit. So there's fiber to that farm, I assume, or
Yes.
at least a good 100 meg connection, right? So I mean,
Yep.
everything you can only go as fast as the slowest connection. So mostly that was like a local area network for 5G on the farm.
Yeah,
The 5G.
that's correct. Yep, it was a local area network, and what we did is, as I mentioned, the hog barns were spread out over a couple miles, and we just used simple microwave to connect them all back to each other is what we did. But then, as I mentioned, we used the 5G as the backhaul into the fiber and stuff like that. But for the most part, we connected everything together into a LAN network, and that's how we handled it, and was able to capture all that information, and then we do analytics on it. And then the analytics came back and gave you the display on the iPad or on your phone.
Okay. Can you talk about smart city stuff for small cities?
Yeah. So from a smart city perspective, there's many applications out there, right? And I think it's really boils down to what is best for that city. So for example, I'll give you a few of them, right? So it could be water meter reading, which I believe it's done today on LTE, but you can do it in 5G going forward. There's smart lighting, so parking lots, things like that, where you can regulate the lighting if you want it on or off, or someone approaches it. That's an example of that. Another one would be, I always use this one from a garbage perspective, right? But this is maybe more of a big city one. But garbage cans, if you have garbage pickup, you can have sensors in the garbage cans to say, hey, I'm full, come pick me up. And then you can optimize routes, things along those lines. I talked about water, lighting. The other one is electricity. That would be another one from a monitoring perspective, right? So in the hot days, you can monitor to see if you're going to need more electricity or not. You can provide notifications, things along those lines. So those are some of the examples of that. Maybe some big city ones would be traffic light regulations and things like that, where you can regulate the traffic lights based off of traffic, and you can have sensors to monitor traffic flow and optimize those. Those would be other examples that you could use. But the whole point of it is all this information can be collected, and then it can be sent out to be something to be executed on, either by a person or by a computer. That's the whole intent behind it, to do analytics on it.
And so because this is licensed spectrum, most of it, is that, do you see this as cities buying services from AT&T or Verizon or T-Mobile? Or do you see them building their own networks to facilitate smart city stuff? How's that going to work?
Yeah, good question. And I'll answer a little bit more broadly first, but then I'll kind of narrow down to what you specifically asked, Bill. But when it comes to enterprise, and I say enterprise, and it also include your cities, but also enterprise businesses, that's the big debate, right? Is, okay, do you go off and purchase your own network and put your own network in? CBRS, is available. Which is shared spectrum. That's available. That can be used too. But then again, the challenge behind that is not only from a city perspective or enterprise, is that you not only have to buy the hardware, you have to have the frequency and the spectrum, but you also have to maintain it then going forward, right? And so there's a big trade-off behind that. Is, hey, do I want to control it all myself, or do I go and work with the operators, the AT&Ts, the Verizons, the T-Mobiles, and sign up for them? And so there's a big debate on that, quite honestly. And it's kind of hard. It really have to narrow it down to what's best for you. But in some cases, I see that some people say, hey, I'm going with the operator, because for me, I don't want to have to deal with all that other stuff at this point in time. Where some of them say, hey, listen, I want to control my own destiny. And in some cases, they've told me that, hey, there's certain features and functionalities that I need that, you know, for my business, where some of the operators in the US are more focused on the consumer and not necessarily on me. And so I've heard both ends of the spectrum at this point, and I'm not trying to knock anybody. That's just what I've been told when I've worked with some of these enterprises at this point. So it really boils down to what's best for you. And it may be a better situation to go work directly with Verizon, AT&T, T-Mobile, because they may be able to work with you on devices and services and things like that.
So two-part question. Do you ever see us catching up to South Korea on this wireless adoption? And do you think we should?
Oh, good question. I think in the long run, I think we will, I guess, right? I believe that we will. And I think it's going to take us a little bit of time in the sense of, I explain it this way, is when 5G rolled out here over the last year, it's been early devices. It's based off of early technology. And now you'll start to see more mainstream 5G come available and I'll give you a prime example. Like, you haven't seen an iPhone with 5G as of yet. And the iPhone will come out this fall with 5G capabilities in it. I believe in my mind that'll help us from the US consumer perspective launch into competing and being this fast growth with 5G, just like you see in South Korea. And because the majority of the phones in the US are iPhones at this point in time. So I see us catching up with them, but it's going to take us a little bit to do that. So.
Okay, good. What does Nokia now sell? I mean, where are you in these markets?
Okay. So from a Nokia perspective, Nokia is, when it comes to infrastructure, both LTE and 5G, we are a complete end-to-end type of solution, much different than our counterparts, right? So and I'll keep it as the high domains, right? So we provide the radio or the RAN side of it, which is all the stuff you see on the towers, right? The antennas, the baseband units at the bottom of the tower. We can provide all that. And then from a transport perspective, so you got to get it from the cell site back to the core. So at the transportation layer, we have solutions that can provide the transportation layer for connectivity, for optical connectivity, fiber, things along those lines is what we have. And then we also have the core network, which handles all the routing of information, all the session controls, all the database management. We have all that. And then on top of all that, we have security. We can overlay on top of all that from an end-to-end perspective. So, and I say, when I bring up security, this has been very important from a public safety and for us working with the US government at this point in time. And then we have services that can now actually do all the deployment. And the reason I bring this up is we're full end-to-end. We are the only vendor end-to-end in the world. A lot of our peers don't have all those pieces to the puzzle. And so that's what gives us an advantage that we have over others at this point. And now, I will say from a Nokia side, device-wise, you will see Nokia devices out there. It's manufactured by HMD, which is based out of Finland, but we license the name to them, and you can use that. So anyway, so that's high level what we provide from a Nokia perspective.
Any comments on the linkage between 5G and the virus?
This has always been a very, very controversial, and I think you may have seen from the news. At least I know in the UK that people were, burning down towers because they thought that it caused COVID to occur, and there's no linkage at all between the two at all. No linkage at all between the two. So it's quite interesting to see that happen. So.
But there are, with all these small cells in urban areas, there's that whole EMF question is back kind of at the forefront, isn't it?
Yeah, we see that pop up. We see it pop up occasionally at this time, and it's always been a big question out there. I think you can go out and look at the studies and see that if how it affects you from a health perspective at this point, but And I would defer to those is what I would do at this time. But again, they pop up. I've seen it here in where I live in the suburbs of Chicago, it being raised. But again, I would point to those health studies out there and what people are saying about it at this point. So.
Okay, great, thanks. I just said there was somebody had sent me an email about that earlier, so I wanted to bring that up.
Mm-hmm.
Other people have questions or additions for Brian?
Yeah.
Go
I
ahead.
have a,
Go ahead, Becky.
oh, okay. This is so interesting, and it's so clear with your slides, Brian. Thank you so much that all the advantages to healthcare delivery, all the advantages to education. I'm wondering, in industry, we'll be replacing laborers. Does South Korea give us an example of how we make sure that we are educating people and still having enough jobs for everybody with so much of the labor and being changed? I was thinking with the advancement of South Korea that there might be some stories on how all the people are finding employment with these changes.
Yeah, good question. I've ran across this before. So using South Korea as you mentioned there, for example. So in the launch of 5G in South Korea, it's mainly all focused on the consumer right now, and that's really what 5G is driven as, is a consumer as of right now. And you can think about it, 5G today that's being launched in Korea, that's being launched here in the US by the big three. It's just more LTE. For us consumers, we just consume more data faster is really what it boils down to. And that's what you're seeing in South Korea as of right now with that growth. The enterprise or business side of it is yet to come to fruition at this point. And I don't see that for another year or two as of right now. As far as when it comes to jobs, I think it's going to vary from industry to industry at this point in time. I think some of this stuff is actually to help with the manufacturing, with analytics, understanding what's going on, quality control, more things along those lines than anything else. Will it replace people? It's a good question. I think that's yet to be determined here from the future perspective, right? So that's how I would look at it. As of right now, I think we're a few years away from a lot of this enterprise happening at this point. But it's just to make things more streamlined here from a manufacturing robotics type of communications and understanding what's really going on. And the example I will give you is in one of the use cases that we did with an operator over in Europe in the manufacturing facility, they were making, I can't remember the part now, but anyway, it doesn't matter. They were making a part and they were using optics to do the analysis on that part. And the optics were able to find the defects that you couldn't find from a human perspective, right? The point behind it is it was actually driving better quality in the manufacturing. And it wasn't replacing anybody. It's just that they were looking for better quality control so that they could improve their product and catch the issue before it rolled out to out to their customers and things like that. So I'll just give you that as another example, that a use case that we've tested with an operator in Europe. So
good. Alex, you're next.
Yeah, I had a couple of comments. Number one is, I think for rural areas, especially in the situation we're in now concerning education for schools and stuff, where I see 5G becoming maybe a major player as far as our delivery of education out in the rural area. Nobody at this point it's become a major political issue the last couple of days on what's going to happen with schools coming up, but I definitely see 5G as a reasonable response to that. And the other comment was that here in Minnesota, about a year or two ago, when 5G was first announced, legislature was tried to pass, or it did pass. I don't know where it's going, where it is now. But the League of Minnesota Cities and here sent out a concern that 5G could come into any city, any location, and developed its system on the city's right-of-ways without the city having any option to get involved in that. And it kind of created a stir at that moment. I haven't heard anything in the last 6 or 7 months, but I wonder if you've run into that situation anywhere.
Yeah, I haven't seen a lot of that. I know there's been, I know the federal government put policies in place to help streamline the process, I guess, and the municipalities had to adhere to it. I know that created problems, I guess, right? I think as you were alluding to. But I think the whole push behind that was to be able to roll 5G out, and not only just 5G, but small cells in general for LTE and things like that too. I haven't seen too much of it. I haven't seen too much of an issue behind it. Now, granted, I will say there could be municipalities or local governments that there may be some challenges that the operators are facing that I'm not aware of, or that I haven't seen it from more of a U.S. perspective. But generally speaking, I have not seen a big issue being raised across the U.S. or across the Midwest that I've seen on some of my research. But I'm not going to say there's not that problem going on with the local municipalities at this point. So,
well, I think the problem was one of at least a couple of the cities that I'm aware of was control of their right of way.
sure.
And I don't think any of them would say, "Hey, don't do it." I think what they wanted to do is just make sure they're included as a player in
Sure.
how it's presented and where it's located and what it looks like.
Yeah, and that's a very good point. And I've seen that too, at least from our end, where we've worked with cities that they want something that looks appealing. So I'll give you an example, right? So as you're putting these things on top of poles or on top of buildings, and some places they have multiple antennas, right? And so we've had operators say, "Hey, I want to put everything in one unit," what they call a shroud. And so you'll put all these antennas or radio heads all in this one container, and it looks like only one container or box sitting on top of a building or on top of a pole. And then we also match color to the pole or to the building, right? So you try to blend it in as much as possible so it doesn't look like all this hardware just hanging off of towers and poles and stuff like that. So a lot of the cities require that. And I know from our perspective at Nokia, we work with the operators in order to help so that equipment, I'll call it, blends in and looks nice, I guess, from a public perspective or to the eye. So, yep.
Yeah.
Alex, mind if I jump in here? So I'm wondering about we hear a lot about 5G not even working in buildings, right? So if somebody has a 5G phone, is that how accurate is that, and what's the workaround, or how does that? Obviously, if somebody has a 5G phone, it has to work inside their office, right? Or in their house.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to that spectrum conversation we had earlier, right? So if you're looking at millimeter wave will not penetrate into a building. You may get through the first wall, but it's unlikely. But if you get in those low bands, like the 600 megahertz of T-Mobile, 850 of AT&T that they have today, those will penetrate a building. You'll have good in building coverage, those types of things. So it's really spectrum driven at that point. And granted, some buildings you may have a lot of concrete and rebar in them, and it may be hard to penetrate those buildings. It may vary, but I would look at it as if on low band, wherever you have LTE, you're going to have 5G on these low bands. But it's that millimeter wave. If you got millimeter wave only, that's going to be, you won't get it in building. And so in order to get it in building, you have to go to an in-building solution, or you have to go to a low band is what you're going to have to go towards. And that's where I mentioned, If you're using millimeter wave indoors, those are usually for your stadiums, convention centers, things like that is what they'll use it for. But that's really what it boils down to. It's kind of really spectrum driven. So you gotta have low band to get indoors.
Okay, I appreciate that. Thanks for that clarification.
Hey, Bill, I've got a question.
Good.
This is Melinda Miller, and of course I work in public safety. And I think one of the things we learned from the COVID-19 is that the sturdiness or how easily accessible the 5G devices are. We saw a lot of damage to the small cells in downtown St. Paul as well as downtown Minneapolis. And it's probably a little too soon to say, what are we doing to fix that problem going forward? But that was a challenge that we did face during the civil unrest, was the 5G infrastructure became a source of a way to do destruction, I guess. Yep, it was destroyed.
Well, that's probably, I would see some of that as a strategy if you're, and we've seen this in Hong Kong, right? With the civil unrest there, where people, the surveillance cameras and so on that are enabled by some of this high technology and facial recognition, data processing kind of things, where people see that now and say, well, let's eliminate that source. So you can see how that would be at risk in any kind of civil disturbance.
So it's kind of,
Brian, do you see that being hardened more as a result of these kind of things, or?
I think it's it's a tough call, actually. I think it's gonna be up to the probably up to the operator to determine how they're gonna handle it from a deployment perspective. Is if do you put it up higher, so people can't get it from the ground? You have to actually make it so they have to actually get up there somehow to do it. And Melinda, I don't know for sure, where those were at as far as on the pole, if they were at the 100 feet up or just 10 feet off the ground type of deal, right? I'm not for sure how they were set up, but I think it'd be up to the operator how they're going to handle that. So,
I heard that we're on light poles. So what are we talking? 20 feet maybe?
20 feet, yeah. Yep, that's exactly right. So. And
those were the small cells.
Yep. Yeah, yes. So I don't know if there's going to be a way to harden it. I think I'm not sure how you'd handle that, quite honestly. So at that point.
Kind of goes to the same kind of thing as some of them put in generators and some of them just have higher response levels.
Right. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep, exactly.
But it kind of speaks to the fact that we not only need small cells, but we still need some of those tall towers in these situations too, that just one solution's not going to work.
It's a good point, Melinda. You're exactly right. Is that small cells, typically when you see small cells, they're based off of you need coverage and or you need capacity in that area, right? And so if you look at 5G, 5G, you use a millimeter wave, it's great from a capacity perspective and putting these small cells in a particular area. And to your point, the towers or on top of buildings is there for another reason, right? It's for broader coverage. It's for you see your lower band, your LTE is already there. So it's just different types of use cases. But yeah, you're right. You need both of them in order to cover all the use cases that are out there, not only for your consumer, but for your enterprise too.
Brian, could you talk about the desirability of a public fiber network to support 5G, kind of using that public network as a open access network for multiple providers?
Yeah, I can speak to it a little bit, I guess. I'm not necessarily my forte, but the little I see with it is that, from a public network perspective, they're going to have to be able to support the amount of capacity that's going to be required, right? And I showed you earlier on of what, I think it was my second slide, of what the consumer is going to use and consume from a data perspective going forward, right? So you're just going to have to be able to support that amount of bandwidth or amount of data coming in, right? And I'll give you an example. Working with an operator several years ago, we were talking about 5G and how much data, could be, used or pumped through a millimeter wave, signal, right? And they did the, oh my, I have to go look at my backhaul, right? and my fiber network to make sure I've got plenty out there. So my point behind it is that make sure that you have it sized correctly, because you don't want the fiber network to be the, you know, the weakest link, I guess is probably the best way of saying it. So that's about the best I could speak to a bill on from that perspective, is just to be prepared to handle the data.
Okay, great. Well, we're at about our time. So Brian, thank you so much. It was really super interesting and digestible. So I really appreciate that from your perspective. And so I really appreciate your participation today and taking the time to be with us.
Thank you, Bill. I appreciate it. Glad to be here. If you guys have any other questions or any of these topics, I could spend hours on. So if you need anything else in the future, let me know.
Thanks so much.
Yep. Thank you.
Mary?
Thanks, everyone. Have a good rest of your day.
Bye-bye.
Bye.